If we could all turn to Isaiah chapter 55. We'll be reading today from verse 1. Isaiah 55, verse 1. Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen diligently to me and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live, and I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. Behold, I made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and commander for the peoples. Behold, you shall call a nation that you do not know, and a nation that you did not know you shall run to, because of the Lord your God and of the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, that he may have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return there, but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. For you shall go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall break forth into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, and instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle. And it shall make a name for the Lord, an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. Amen. You may be seated. Not too long ago at my work, they recently replaced some of the sidewalks around the building, and on the day that the contractors were out there pouring the wet cement, I was getting ready to go home for the day, and I was getting ready to walk out of the same door that I walk out of every single day. And there were no signs posted, there was no caution tape up on the door. And I go to open the door, and I'm this close into stepping into wet cement when something catches my eye. And I notice that there is already a partial footprint in the wet cement, and not too far from that footprint, someone had taken their finger and they drew two initials and a cute little heart in the cement. And thankfully that caught my eye just in time, and I didn't end up stepping in the cement. And now every single day when I walk through that door, I see those initials, I see that little heart that someone drew into the cement. And I was thinking to myself and wondering, I wonder who in our building would have drawn that in the cement. That seems like a little bit of a childish thing to do, something you expect from two teenagers who are in love. I'm surprised that an adult at our building would do something like that. And as I was thinking about that, it made me realize that we as humans, regardless of whether we are old or young or teenagers or not, at our deepest level, we all long for a love that lasts. We all long for a love that will never fade away. In Isaiah chapter 55, Isaiah prophesies that God is going to make an everlasting covenant with his people. And this covenant would be everlasting because, unlike previous covenants, this covenant would not be conditioned on the goodness or performance of man, but rather it would be conditioned on the goodness and faithfulness of God. And God would demonstrate the magnitude of his love by spilling his blood for us on the cross. And God would demonstrate the resilience of his love by overcoming even death itself, proving that his love would last. But despite Isaiah's prophecy in chapter 55, some 700 or 800 years later, the Jewish people largely rejected the everlasting covenant that God wanted to make with his people. And today, in our world, we see that people turn their back on the offer that God is extending to them. And even in the church, sometimes we might want to pick and choose parts of the covenant that we like and ignore other parts. And in essence, what we're doing then is rejecting the good things that God has to offer. And tonight I want us to take a look at why that is, why we reject the good things that God has for us. And the first reason that we're going to look at is because we don't believe that we are in need. In verse 1, Isaiah writes, "Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price." The invitation that's made here is for those who first recognize that they are thirsty, and second, recognize that they have no money. It's an invitation for those who realize, yes, I'm thirsty. Yes, I long for a love that lasts. I long for a covenant. I long to be in a relationship with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But I also realize that I am spiritually bankrupt, that there are no riches that I have, whether material or spiritual, that could ever earn or merit or purchase such a resilient, pure love from God. Our world rejects Jesus, and our world rejects the offer that God has for us because, frankly, they don't see a need. They don't think that they need God. If you were to ask a random person on the street, do you think that you're a good person? 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you, yeah, I'm a pretty good person. I've got a couple flaws, but overall, I'm a pretty good person. And we as humans, we tend to oversell what we think are our redeeming qualities, and we sweep aside, we sweep under the rug those things that we're actually ashamed of. Those things like lies, pride, lust, greed, all those things that we want to ignore. And we lie to ourselves, convincing ourselves that we, in fact, are good and have no need of God. And in the church, a similar sentiment can creep in. We can start to believe that we can be good apart from God. We can start to believe that we have graduated from dependence on God, that we have graduated to new levels of righteousness, and now we no longer need to seek the presence of God. We no longer need to seek to know him deeper, because now we've made it. We can just coast until heaven. But we don't just need God's presence on the day of our salvation or baptism to be holy, but we need God's presence every day to live a holy life. And if we think that we have anything of value apart from God, that's a very dangerous place to be, because then we won't see the need to pursue deep relationship with Jesus Christ. If we think that we are righteous, that we can be righteous apart from God, then we won't desire to obtain the righteousness that comes from God alone. If we think that we can be wise apart from God, then we won't desire the wisdom that comes from God alone. If we think that we are good leaders, that we've been such great captains of our ship, that we've made such great decisions throughout life, then we won't see the need to rely on the good shepherd to lead us day after day. Apart from God, though, there's no goodness in us. There's nothing of value in us. And all those things that we think are good apart from him, those are just pride and self-righteousness masquerading as good. But the more we recognize how fragile we are, the more we recognize how broken we are, the more we recognize that our hearts are prone to wander, that our hearts are prone to stray, the sweeter the presence of God will taste to us. And the more we'll press in to know him, the more we'll say, God, I know that without you, I know where my heart turns. I know that I'm prone to wander from you. I need you, Lord. There's nothing good in me apart from you, and I need you to help me live a holy life, a life that is pleasing to you. Next, we might reject the good things of God because we aren't listening diligently to the voice of God. In verse 2, Isaiah writes, "Listen diligently to me and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food." God is continually trying to speak to us. He's continually trying to draw us into relationship with him. God is always trying to speak to us with his voice. And the primary way that he does this is through his word. And we're so blessed that we can read the word of God in a language that we can understand. Many people throughout history did not have that same privilege. And God also speaks to us through dreams, through prophecy. God speaks to us through his creation. Psalm 19 verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." That means every single day when you and I walk to our car, the heavens are shouting out. The heavens are yelling. They're trying to get your attention. And they're trying to say, look at the glory of God. Look at how magnificent he is. Look at how powerful he is. And isn't it funny that even though creation does that, so many times we don't hear that voice. We don't hear the voice of God trying to speak to us through creation, trying to point us to his goodness. I think many of us believe that listening is a very passive act, that it doesn't require much discipline, it doesn't require much effort, and I believe that's why audiobooks have become so popular lately. It's so much easier to listen to a book than to set time aside to just read through the book. It's much easier to just put in your headphones and listen to the book. And I noticed at work, when things aren't too crazy, I like to put in my headphones and I like to listen to some songs, some sermons, some videos on YouTube, and I noticed that it's very easy for me to miss that which I'm listening to. It's very easy for me to have an email pop up on my laptop screen and then suddenly I've missed 10 or 15 minutes of the sermon that I'm listening to. And the reason for that is because I'm listening passively, I'm not listening actively, and there's a huge difference between the two. One is listening, and the other one is just merely hearing. If we want to listen to the voice of God, then we need to set aside holy time. Holy time is time that is set apart. Time where you're not multitasking, trying to do something else. It's time where you intentionally desire to hear the voice of God, intentionally desire to seek his face. And the biggest enemies of intimacy with God are hurriedness and distraction. And as Christians, we have an obligation not just to fight against sin, but we also have an obligation to fight against distraction, against those things that try and crowd out our schedules so that we no longer have time to seek the face of God. Ultimately, the number one good thing that God can give you is his presence. The ultimate good that God can give you is himself. It's far better of a good than any nice job. It's far better of a good than any nice house or spouse or even our families or even our health. The number one good thing that God could give you is his presence. And if we truly believe that, we would, as it says in verse 6, we would seek the Lord while he may be found. We would call upon him while he is near. And finally, we might reject the good things that God has to offer to us because we don't believe that what he's offering is actually good. In verse 8, It says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." There can be a huge disconnect between what we think is good and what God says is good. There can be a huge disconnect between what the world says is good and what God says is good. And sometimes we can believe the lie that we know what's better for us than God does, that we have a better idea of sex, gender roles, and marriage than God does. And that's what the world says. They say God's ideas about all these things, they're outdated. The new ideas are the good ideas. They'll liberate you. They'll give you joy. They'll give you pleasure. They'll give you all that you dream of. And that couldn't be further from the truth. The world says to chase after things like sensuality, riches, pleasure. And oftentimes those are the things that lead towards destruction. And meanwhile, the things that the world says aren't good, things like discipline or even things like affliction, those are things that God uses as instruments for good in his hand. As the psalmist said, "It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes." The world today is trying to redefine everything. They're trying to redefine what good means. They're trying to redefine what marriage means. They try and redefine what racism is. They're constantly redefining terms. And if we want to know what goodness is, the true definition of goodness, we need to know who God is. We need to know God's character if we want to know what goodness is, because he's the source of everything that is good and true in this world. And that means we need to know the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament. We don't get to pick and choose. And atheists will often say, "You Christians, you worship two different gods. One's nice, one's mean, one's old, one's new." And that's not true. It's the same God, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The same God is serious with sin in the Old Testament and the New Testament. The same God shows mercy in the Old Testament and the New Testament. We need to know the full character of God and progress to knowing more and more of God. As Christians, we love to sing about the goodness of God, and there's no problem with that. In fact, we did that this morning. We sang about the goodness of God. But is it possible that when we sing about the goodness of God, what we have in mind is a God who's not serious with sin, a God who's not serious about justice, a God who never tells us how to live our lives, a God who never gives us any instruction for how to live our lives? Because if that's the idea that we have in our mind of a good God, then may I suggest that what we're worshiping is not a good God, but an evil God. Because a God who doesn't care about sin, a God who doesn't care about justice, is a weak and passive God. And a God who doesn't give any instruction to his children on how to live their lives is not a good God, but a negligent father. And that's not who we worship. We worship a good Father. This week I read an article that said, had the headline, 6 huge societal problems that could be solved by saving sex for marriage. And in this article it said, if we saved sex for marriage like the Bible teaches us, then in our society we would see less fatherlessness, we would see less divorce, less poverty, less STDs, abortion, sexual assault. All these things if we just followed God's design for sex and for marriage. But man, in his pride, in his hubris, he said, you know what? I think we can do it better than God. I think we have a better design. And look at the carnage that resulted in the pride of man, thinking that he knows better than God. God's ways lead to life. Jesus offers everlasting life, an everlasting covenant, and an everlasting love. And my hope is that we would not turn our back on what Jesus has to offer, and that we would realize that we are desperately in need of him, that we would listen diligently to his voice, and that we would trust him, believing that what he has to offer is in fact good. Amen.